Welcome to Voices of History, the podcast where we unearth the most fascinating and revealing stories from our past. Today, we embark on an epic journey across the Caribbean seas, where we will explore the discovery and daring conquest of the Darien and the mainland. Get ready to enter a world of adventures, conflicts, and discoveries that marked the course of our history.
Welcome to another deep dive. Today, we're taking on a fascinating topic, the early Spanish colonization in the Americas.
And we'll be going beyond those, typical heroic explorer narratives.
Right. We're going to dig into specifically the Darien region,
which is in present-day Panama and Colombia.
Exactly. And to do that, we've got some great source material to work with.
We do.
We've got selections from a Spanish-language history book, El Oro del Darién.
The Gold of Darien. Very appropriate.
Yes. And we've also got an episode from a Spanish-language podcast, La Conquista vi las islas y tierra firme.
And these sources, they really give us a glimpse into the chaotic and often, brutal realities of the conquest.
Yeah, it's not always pretty.
No, not at all.
But it's important to understand the full picture, right?
Absolutely, and that's what we're aiming to do in this deep dive.
So our mission today is to uncover the motivations, the alliances, the conflicts that really shaped this era.
And we're going to hopefully uncover some surprising facts.
Yeah, things that challenge those traditional historical accounts.
Right. One of the things that really struck me, as I was going through these sources, is just how challenging the environment itself was.
Okay, so paint a picture for our listeners.
Sure.
What was the Darien region actually like back then?
Imagine dense jungles, almost impenetrable, treacherous swamps, and a climate that even those hardened Spanish explorers described as just incredibly difficult.
Unhealthy.
Yeah, unhealthy and just, really challenging. El Oro del Darién really emphasizes this.
So not exactly the tropical paradise we might picture when we think about, exploration and discovery.
No. This was hardcore survival mode from the start.
And that really sets the stage for all the drama that unfolds, right?
Yeah.
Because it wasn't just the elements they were battling.
Oh, absolutely not. They were also, they were contending with each other.
Let's talk about the cast of characters then, because the podcast introduces, a real mix of personality.
It does.
We've got Vasco Núñez de Balboa, famously known for reaching the Pacific Ocean.
Right.
And then there's Pedrarias Dávila,
the governor of Castilla del Oro.
And he had, as we learn, a very complicated relationship with Balboa.
Very complicated. A lot of rivalry there.
Driven by ambition, power, gold, all of that.
Exactly. They wanted to carve out their own little empires in this new world.
Which ultimately, as detailed in El Oro del Darién, led to Balboa's execution.
It did. And of course, we can't forget about figures like Alonso de Ojeda and Diego de Nicuesa.
Oh, right. They were also vying for control in this region.
Absolutely. It was a very high-stakes game.
It's like a real-life historical drama, with power struggles and betrayals.
And backstabbing.
But these individuals, they weren't acting alone. They commanded these military forces. What were they called?
The Huestes.
Huestes. Okay. So I guess, when we think about conquistadors, we imagine this unified army.
Right, this homogenous force.
Yeah, but that's not really accurate, is it?
Not quite. It was actually quite a diverse group.
Interesting. What kind of people were in these Huestes?
Well, El Oro del Darién tells us that you had noblemen, of course,
right,
soldiers, adventurers, and even, some unaccepted figures like there was a young nobleman, Luis Carrillo, very inexperienced.
Wow, that's fascinating.
Yeah.
What else made up these Huestes?
Well, alongside this kind of motley crew of people, they had a really surprisingly complex structure.
Really?
You had royal guards, making sure that the king's interests were being protected.
So even in this remote outpost, the king was keeping tabs on things.
Absolutely. They even had artillery.
Artillery in the jungle.
Yes. And believe it or not, musicians.
A marching band in the jungle. That's a detail you don't get in, your typical history book.
Uh-huh.
It really makes you wonder how the indigenous people must have perceived all of this. They weren't just passive bystanders in this story, were they?
Absolutely not. The sources mention diverse indigenous groups. You have the Cueva people, also known as the Cueva or Cuevacuna.
Okay.
The Guanacaste and others, they weren't just, standing by and watching this happen.
They had their own societies, right?
It did. They had established social structures with caciques or chiefs,
right,
elaborate ceremonies, and even some really impressive architectural adaptations like They built villages in trees.
In trees? Why would they do that?
To avoid floods and hurricanes. Those were common in the region.
Wow, that's pretty ingenious.
It is, and it really shows how adaptable they were.
So they were clearly, not less advanced than the Europeans, as some might assume. How did they react to the arrival of these Husties, these conquistadors with their cannons and their marching bands?
Well, they weren't just, defending their territory. They were defending their cultures, their beliefs, their way of life.
So the Spanish arrival was a threat to everything they knew.
Absolutely. They resisted the Spanish in different ways. Sometimes they fought back directly. Other times they formed strategic alliances with the Spanish against rival groups, trying to play the game to their advantage.
So it was a complex situation with shifting alliances and motivations.
Absolutely. It was a constant struggle for survival.
It wasn't a simple conquest, but a complex interplay of ambitions, survival, and resistance. And of course, we can't overlook the darker side of this story, the brutality.
Right, the brutality inflicted on the indigenous people.
And that's a part of history we really need to confront, even if it's uncomfortable.
Absolutely. It's crucial to understand that this happened. And both the podcast and El Oro del Darién provide some really disturbing details. The use of war dogs against indigenous populations.
Oh, wow.
The practice of enslavement. Forced labor in the mines. And, of course, the devastating impact of European diseases.
It's a lot to process. And all of this ambition and conquest and resistance, it was fundamentally driven by money. It really makes you think about the economics of conquest. What did El Oro del Darién reveal about how these expeditions were financed?
Well, for starters, it shows that the Spanish crown wanted their cut of the action.
They always do.
They imposed a 20% tax on all treasures claimed. It was called the quinto real.
20%. That's quite a chunk.
Yeah.
Seems like even in the untamed jungles of the Darien, there is no escaping the tax man.
Nope. The crown always got its due. But of course, getting that gold in the first place, that was no easy feat.
I can imagine. So how did they do it?
Well, they used several methods, mining, obviously, but also raiding. They called them cabalgadas.
Cabalgadas, what were those?
Armed expeditions into indigenous territories, basically to seize gold and valuables.
So not exactly a peaceful exchange of goods.
No, not at all. And from our sources, we also know that there was some trading and bartering going on.
So the Spanish weren't just brute force conquerors. They were also playing the economic game, trying to make deals.
That's right. And here's where it gets really interesting. The indigenous groups actually valued copper very highly, sometimes even more than gold.
Really?
Yes. And the Spanish, they were quick to recognize this.
And exploit it.
Exactly.
So they were not only contending with this challenging environment, resistance from the indigenous people, but they were also operating within this very intricate financial system.
That's right.
It must have been a real balancing act.
It was. But amidst all this, they were also trying to establish permanent settlements, to really solidify their control.
Right. And that brings us to Santa María de la Antigua, the first major Spanish settlement on the mainland. What could you tell us about that?
Well, it was founded in 1510, strategically located on the Gulf of Urabá.
Okay.
El Oro del Darién describes it as the capital of Castilla del Oro at the time.
So it was really a symbol of Spanish ambition in this new world. But we know it was eventually abandoned. Why was that?
A combination of factors, really. Disease was a big problem. There were constant conflicts with indigenous groups. And then, there was always the lure of new, potentially richer territories.
So even in the midst of conquest, permanence was a struggle. It's interesting how that theme keeps coming up. So for our listeners, what are some of the key takeaways from this initial exploration of the Darien conquest?
Well, I think the biggest takeaway is that this was far more complex than a simple narrative of European dominance. We have the challenging environment, the indigenous resistance, the power struggles within the Spanish ranks. It was a messy and often brutal reality.
Yeah, it's really shattering those simple narratives, isn't it? But as we continue this deep dive, one question looms large. Given all the brutality, all the challenges, why did the Spanish persist?
Why didn't they just give up and go home?
Exactly. What fueled their ambition, despite the odds stacked against them?
That's a great question, and one we'll be exploring further as we delve deeper into this fascinating chapter of history.
Welcome back to our deep dive into the Darien. We uncovered some pretty surprising stuff in part one.
We did. It wasn't exactly the sail in and find gold story you might expect.
No, not at all. Harsh environment.
diverse indigenous resistance.
Complex power struggles within the Spanish ranks. We even got into the economics of it all. Remember that fascinating 20% tax on treasures?
Oh, yeah, the quinta real.
The quinta real, that's right. It wasn't just about the crown getting rich, though, was it?
No, it was also about control, right? Keeping those conquistadors in check.
Makes sense. Speaking of control, those officials, the veededor de los rescates, what exactly was their role again? I'm having trouble keeping all these Spanish terms straight.
Oh, they were basically the crown's, their eyes and ears,
Ah.
making sure things were running smoothly.
Overseeing those trade deals with the indigenous groups.
Exactly. And making sure that, making sure the crown got its share. It's a good reminder that even in this chaotic world of conquest, there was still, bureaucracy, paperwork.
So even while battling mosquitoes and indigenous warriors, they were still filing their expense reports.
Mm-hmm.
Amazing. But financing these expeditions, it wasn't just about taxes, was it? There were investments, loans.
Oh, yeah. It was a whole system. You could almost call it like early venture capital.
Really? That's interesting.
Yeah, these expeditions were expensive, ships, supplies, weapons, men willing to, risk everything.
So you had wealthy merchants, investors back in Spain, hoping to get a big return.
Hoping to strike it rich, a very high-risk, high-reward game.
And for the indigenous populations, well, the economic realities of the conquest were often brutal. We've talked about forced labor, but those cabalgatas, those raids, they really highlight the violence.
Yeah, the cabalgatas were brutal. Armed expeditions into indigenous territories, just seizing gold and whatever else they could get their hands on.
Causing immense suffering. It's a stark reminder of, the dark side of human nature, I guess you could say. Greed, ambition, all of that.
And those acts had consequences for the Spanish, too. Remember that black legend we touched on earlier?
Yeah, can you explain that a bit more? I'm still not entirely clear on what that was all about.
So the black legend, it was this narrative spread mainly by Spain's rivals that basically painted Spanish colonization as uniquely barbaric.
Focusing on the violence.
Exactly. The forced conversions, the diseases, all of it. Trying to make them look as bad as possible.
So a propaganda campaign of sorts?
You could say that,
No.
but it was rooted in, in some truth, some very uncomfortable truth.
Always that nuance, right?
Right. But it's important to understand how these narratives get shaped and manipulated.
It's fascinating, really, how history can be used. But let's get back to the Darien for a moment. We know the indigenous people, they weren't just, sitting back and taking all this. They fought back. They adapted. They even formed alliances. What did we learn from our sources about those different forms of resistance?
Well, they showed incredible resilience. They used their knowledge of the terrain to their advantage.
Guerrilla warfare tactics, right?
Exactly. Ambushes, poison arrows, the whole 9 yards. They made it very difficult for the Spanish.
So they were fighting smart.
Oh, yeah, they had to. And the resistance wasn't limited to armed conflict either. They formed alliances.
Sometimes with the Spanish themselves, right?
Yeah.
Against other indigenous groups.
That's right. A very complex and fluid situation. They were just trying to survive, trying to maintain some level of control.
That's a fascinating example of human agency in the face of overwhelming odds, isn't it? They didn't just give up. They found ways to resist.
And they resisted in many different ways. They preserved their cultures, their languages, even when forced to adapt to Spanish rule.
So they were protecting their identities.
Absolutely, their very essence. And they even engaged in, more subtle forms of resistance, slowing down work in the mines, damaging equipment.
Acts of sabotage.
Exactly, little acts of defiance that, could add up over time.
It's inspiring to see, really. It wasn't just about brute force. It was about intelligence, cunning, just that sheer determination to survive. But let's go back to the Spanish side of things for a moment. We've talked about their motivations, the economics, the challenges, but who were these conquistadors, really? What kind of person risks everything to go to this harsh, unforgiving environment?
Well, it's easy to imagine them as, these hardened soldiers.
Adventurers.
Right, but many were actually, quite young, inexperienced.
Drawn to the Americas by the promise of wealth, land, a new life.
A fresh start. A chance to escape poverty or just, limited prospects back in Spain.
So it wasn't always about greed or glory.
No, for some it was about opportunity, a chance at a better life. And let's not forget that that allure of the unknown, the chance to explore new lands, to encounter new cultures.
It really was a historical gold rush, wasn't it? Driven by dreams of riches and a thirst for adventure. But these individuals, they weren't operating in a vacuum, right? They were part of a larger system, tools of Spanish expansionism. We talked about Pedrarias Dávila, the governor of Castilla del Oro, and his role in establishing Spanish control.
Yeah.
How did these individuals navigate the demands of their superiors, while still pursuing their own ambitions?
Oh, it was a balancing act, for sure. They were accountable to the crown, to their patrons, but they also had their own, their own desires, and often those things clash.
I'm thinking of that rivalry between Balboa and Pedrarias. It just shows how personal ambition and those power struggles could really erupt.
Yeah, things could get ugly.
But even beyond those internal conflicts, they faced tremendous challenges. It wasn't just about battling indigenous resistance or, navigating those dense jungles.
No, the sources paint a pretty grim picture of what they had to endure. Disease, starvation, mutinies, constant attacks. The climate itself was brutal.
Just imagine trying to trek through the jungle in heavy armor, carrying all your supplies in that heat and humidity.
It was grueling. Many weren't prepared for it. Some died from disease, some in battle, some just gave up and went back to Spain completely broken. The Darien was a crucible, It forged those who survived into something else entirely.
It's a reminder that the human cost of conquest extended to the conquerors themselves. They paid a price too.
They absolutely did.
And it's through those stories, both the famous ones and the ones we've forgotten, that we can really understand this era.
We move beyond the simple heroes and villains.
Right. We start to see these individuals as, as people making choices, often very difficult choices.
In a context of immense pressure, uncertainty.
It's like we're putting together a puzzle, Each story adds another piece.
And we start to realize that there wasn't just one Spanish perspective
Right.
or one indigenous perspective. There were many.
That's what makes history so interesting, isn't it? Realizing that even these huge events are ultimately the result of individual actions.
Choices and consequences.
Exactly. So let's turn our attention to another element that played a big role: religion. We know that the Spanish conquest happened during a period of intense religious fervor in Europe. How did that zeal manifest itself in the Darien?
Well, for the Spanish, religion was a powerful justification.
Right. They saw themselves as bringing Christianity to the
heathens.
To the heathens, yes.
Yeah.
Saving souls.
Fulfilling a divine mission.
It sounds a bit convenient, doesn't it? Using religion as a cover for conquest and exploitation.
It certainly was convenient, and there's no denying that it was often used to mask less noble motives. But it's also important to remember that many Spaniards genuinely believed this. They really thought they were saving these people.
So a mix of genuine belief and cynical manipulation. How did this play out in their interactions with the indigenous people?
Well, they often incorporated religious rituals into their interactions. Baptisms, erecting crosses, processions, trying to impress and convert the natives.
And how did that go over? The indigenous people, they had their own belief systems, their own spiritual traditions. They weren't just blank slates waiting to be written on.
No, absolutely not. And they resisted those attempts at conversion. They saw it as a threat to their own beliefs, their way of life.
And the Spanish didn't exactly help their cause by destroying indigenous religious artifacts and temples?
No, they didn't. They saw those things as, as idols, paganism. Something to be eradicated.
That's devastating. It wasn't just about converting people, it was about erasing their existing traditions.
Their connection to their past.
Right, their ancestors, their history.
It was a form of cultural destruction that had a deep impact. Their beliefs were intertwined with their identity, their sense of belonging.
So destroying those sacred spaces was like tearing apart the fabric of their society.
Exactly.
It's a stark reminder that the conquest wasn't just about physical domination. It was about cultural and spiritual subjugation.
It was about control.
But you mentioned earlier that the relationship between religion and conquest wasn't always so straightforward. Were there any instances where religion actually played a more positive role?
Yes, there were. Some priests and missionaries, they actually acted as advocates for the indigenous people.
Really?
Yeah, they denounced the abuses of the conquistadors. They tried to protect their rights.
So even within the church, there were those dissenting voices, people who saw the humanity of the indigenous people.
Who spoke out against the injustice.
It's a small glimmer of hope, in this often very dark story.
It is.
And it's also worth noting that the indigenous people weren't just passively accepting these new beliefs.
No, they adapted Christianity to their own context.
Creating these hybrid forms of religious expression.
Blending traditions.
So it was a two-way street in a sense.
To some extent, yes. It shows how resilient cultures can be.
So what's the takeaway for our listeners regarding the role of religion in the Spanish conquest? It seems pretty complicated.
I think the key takeaway is that it was complex, multifaceted. It was used to justify violence and exploitation, yes, but it also inspired, some acts of compassion, cultural exchange. It's a reminder that even the most powerful forces can be used for both good and evil.
It seems like nuance is really the theme of our deep dive here, isn't it?
No easy answers.
No simple narratives. It's a story of ambition, brutality, resilience, and even some moments of cooperation.
And speaking of triumphs and tragedies, we touched on the story of Santa María de la Antigua earlier, the first major Spanish settlement on the mainland.
Founded by Balboa himself.
Right. And it eventually met a rather sad end.
A culmination of factors, really. Disease, indigenous resistance, and just that constant search for gold.
It's fascinating how even in the midst of conquest, that idea of permanence, it was a struggle.
It really was. Santa María de la Antigua is a good reminder that even the grandest ventures, they can be undone by forces both within and outside of our control. Can you tell us a bit more about its founding, its significance?
Well, it was founded in 1510 on the Gulf of Urabá.
Strategically important location.
Oh, incredibly so. It was a gateway to the South American mainland, a real statement of intent by the Spanish.
And as the capital of Castilla del Oro, it must have felt like the center of their world.
The pinnacle of Spanish power. A bustling hub of activity, trade, exploration. But like so many stories from this era, it was a story of both, of promise and peril.
So what led to its downfall then? Was it simply the lure of those richer territories elsewhere?
Well, it played a role, but it was more than that. The location itself was difficult, very swampy, lots of mosquitoes, prone to disease outbreaks.
And the constant threat of indigenous attacks.
Exactly. It was a perfect storm of challenges.
A harsh environment, relentless resistance, and those internal divisions within the Spanish ranks.
Always that hunger for gold.
It's almost like a microcosm of the entire Spanish venture in the Darien, isn't it?
It is. It shows that nothing was guaranteed.
Even for a settlement as important as Santa María de la Antigua. And it raises a question, if this settlement founded by Balboa couldn't survive, what hope was there for others?
Right. It makes you wonder about the long-term viability of the whole enterprise.
And it brings us back to that question we keep asking, doesn't it?
Yeah.
If things were so difficult, why did they persist?
Why didn't they just cut their losses and go home? It's a tough one. I think the answer lies somewhere in that mix of, of ambition, greed, religious zeal, and maybe just a refusal to admit defeat.
The human spirit is a strange and powerful thing.
It is.
And that tenacity, it really shaped the course of history.
It did, for better or for worse.
And it's through understanding those motivations that we can begin to understand this era.
To piece together that complex puzzle.
So as we move towards the final part of our deep dive, I'm left with a sense of awe, really, at the scale of it all. The challenges, the impact.
And it's important to remember that the story of the Darién, it doesn't end with the Spanish conquest.
No, it doesn't. The indigenous people who live there, their cultures, their resilience, they continue to shape the present day.
Their voices deserve to be heard.
Absolutely. And their legacy of resistance, adaptation, cultural preservation, it's inspiring.
It is.
So as we move forward, let's remember to acknowledge the injustices.
And to celebrate the enduring spirit of the indigenous peoples.
And with that, let's move into the final part of our exploration. We've looked at the big picture, the power struggles, the clash of cultures. Now let's zoom in on the individuals, the human stories. Welcome back to the final part of our Darien deep dive. Wow, it's been quite a journey, hasn't it?
It really has. From those unforgiving jungles to those Husties with their marching bands.
I know, right? Who knew? And those intricate economic systems, the role of religion, we've covered a lot.
We have. And these sources have really given us, I think, a much deeper understanding of this whole period.
Yeah, it's been fascinating to see how complex it all was. Not just a simple tale of European dominance, like we might have assumed going in.
No, not at all. It was messy, very human, full of ambition, violence, resilience, and even some moments of, I guess you could say, unexpected cooperation.
We've talked a lot about the negatives, the brutality of the conquest, the exploitation, the impact on the indigenous societies. But were there any positives, any instances of genuine exchange or cooperation that emerged from all of this?
That's a good question, and one we need to consider carefully, because while we have to acknowledge the immense suffering, we also have to recognize that human interactions are, well, they're rarely black and white.
So are you saying there were shades of gray?
Oh.
That even amidst all the darkness, there were, some glimmers of light?
I think so, yeah. The conquest was a period of tremendous upheaval, that's no doubt. But it also led to the exchange of ideas, technologies, even languages.
Can you give our listeners some specific examples of that?
Well, one of the most significant was the introduction of new crops and livestock to the Americas.
Wow.
Things like horses, cattle, pigs,
Yeah.
wheat, other staples that had a huge impact on agriculture and diets in the New World.
That's interesting. So even though it was disruptive, it really reshaped things.
It did, yeah.
Were there other areas where this exchange happened?
Oh, absolutely. You can see it in art, music, even clothing. Indigenous traditions influencing Spanish colonial art.
Right.
European instruments and styles making their way into indigenous musical practices.
Mm-hmm.
It was a fusion, even though it happened within a context of power imbalance.
So not exactly a level playing field, you're saying?
No, not at all. The Spanish were definitely the dominant force. But even so, you can find instances where indigenous knowledge was valued, even adopted by the Spanish.
Do you have an example of that?
Yeah. Sure. The Spanish relied heavily on indigenous guides and interpreters, to help them navigate the terrain, to communicate. Those individuals were crucial to the success of their expeditions. Their knowledge was really prized.
Yeah, it shows that even in a conquest scenario, there was still a recognition of the value of local expertise.
Right.
It's a good reminder that history is rarely a simple story of victors and vanquished.
It's much more nuanced than that.
But let's get back to those individuals who were at the forefront of this whole drama, the conquistadors. We've talked about them in general terms, but I'm curious to dig a bit deeper into their individual experiences. Who were these men? What drove them to risk their lives in such a harsh and unforgiving land?
Well, it's easy to kind of, to fall into stereotypes, to imagine them all as hardened soldiers driven by greed.
And glory.
And glory, yeah. But that's rarely the whole story.
Who were they?
They came from all walks of life, really. Some were soldiers. Yes, some were just, ambitious young men looking for a better life.
A chance to reinvent themselves.
Exactly. Some were driven by religion, some by a thirst for adventure. Some just wanted to prove themselves, to make something of their lives.
It sounds like the Darien attracted a certain type, someone who was willing to take risks, to endure hardship, to face the unknown.
That's a good way to put it, yeah. And it's through their stories, both the famous and the forgotten, that we can really start to grasp the human side of all of this.
We've talked about Balboa, the explorer who crossed the Isthmus of Panama to reach the Pacific. He's often portrayed as a hero. Mm-hmm. What was he?
Balboa is a complex figure. He was a skilled leader, a daring explorer, but he was also ruthless in his dealings with the indigenous people. He engaged in raids, he enslaved people, he showed very little respect for their cultures.
So even the heroes of this era had a dark side.
They did, and it's a reminder that history it's rarely about clear-cut heroes and villains. It's much more complicated than that.
It's about recognizing that these individuals were products of their time,
operating within a system that often rewarded cruelty.
Which brings us back to that black legend concept we've mentioned a few times.
Mm-hmm.
Can you remind our listeners what that was and how it shaped people's perceptions of the conquest?
Sure. The black legend, it was this narrative, spread mostly by Spain's rivals, that basically portrayed Spanish colonization as uniquely cruel. As I said before, it focused on the violence, the forced conversions, the exploitation. It was designed to make the Spanish look as bad as possible.
So propaganda, but with some truth mixed in.
Yeah, it was a way of using history to score points, to demonize an enemy.
It's a challenge, isn't it? Trying to understand history, trying to sift through those competing narratives and figure out what really happened.
It is, yeah. It's one of the things that makes it so fascinating. We're always piecing together those fragments, interpreting the evidence.
And recognizing that those accounts they're often subjective.
They are, absolutely.
And I think that's a fitting note to end on as we wrap up our deep dive into the Darien. We haven't found all the answers, but I think we've uncovered, a lot of insights into this whole period.
I think so. We've seen the motivations, the challenges, the brutality, the moments of cooperation.
We've seen how the indigenous people, they resisted, they adapted, they found ways to survive.
Their stories are inspiring, and they're a reminder that even in the face of tremendous adversity, hope can endure.
And for our listeners, I think the biggest takeaway is that history is a conversation. It's about asking questions, challenging assumptions, and being open to those complexities, those contradictions that are always present in the human experience.
The Darien is just one chapter in that conversation, but it's a chapter full of lessons that we can still learn from today.
So as we conclude this deep dive, I want to encourage our listeners to keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep seeking out those hidden stories that are often there just beneath the surface, because it's through those stories, those individual voices and experiences, that we can really understand the past and its impact on the world we live in today.
So much for our journey today through the seas and lands that saw the first steps of colonization in the New World. But this is just the beginning. In the next episode of Voices of History, we will unravel the mysteries and challenges faced by the conquistadors in their quest for wealth and power in the Americas. Don't miss it, because history always has something more to tell.